by a gentleman named Hecataeus of Abdera, who was writing a history of Egypt. Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest, echoes of Manetho in the biblical Exodus story, which is really responding against some of the slanderous things that he wrote. A really major source was Plato's Laws. Plato's Laws was the last dialogue that Plato wrote. He talked about how to create the constitution and laws for a new nation, a new colony. He said that in order for any new nation to succeed, you had to persuade the citizens that their new laws were actually ancient, given by the gods, unchanged since the dawn of time. It was basically theocratic, that God was ruling the nation through these divine laws and through a council of theologians and priests and things. So a lot of this comes from Plato. None of it comes from the Hebrew Bible. I mean, it's totally different from the Hebrew Bible. Moses never made it into the Promised Land, much less built Jerusalem's temple. So, the Elephantine Papyri are actual documents from about 450 to 400 BC from a Jewish military colony on the Nile, the first cataract of the Nile. And there's about 80 documents, and they talk about Jewish religious life, their temple at Elephantine. You probably didn't know that. Some viewers might not know that, the Jews had their own temple in Egypt, and all sorts of interesting customs that are really seriously scandalous to biblical scholarship. So I'm going to introduce my little discussion of the Elephantine Papyri by asking the question, how do we know about the Jews of ancient times? Well, there's two traditional sources of information. One of them is the biblical writings. If you read the biblical writings, you'll find out that the Jews descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they were one of the 12 tribes of Israel, that Moses led the tribes of Israel out of Egypt, founded the nation of the Jews and the Israelites and their laws. Then after a few centuries, there was the first King David, and his son Solomon built a temple at Jerusalem, the one temple where Yahweh was supposed to be worshipped. And then later on, there was the fall of Jerusalem to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Jews went into exile. In the Persian period, they finally came back under Ezra the priest around 450 BC, when the nation of the Jews, repented and turned to the laws written in the books of Moses. That's the history that you get if you read the books of the Bible at face value. And it would help if we knew that those stories were actually as old as they claim to be. If we knew that Moses wrote the books of Moses, and if these books were all written by the time of Ezra, then we'd have a lot more confidence that you can just read the Bible and that tells you what the Jews were doing back then. And, everyone encourages you to accept that. I mean, your mom and dad says you can believe it. Your pastor says you can believe it. Even university scholars and biblical critics say they were pretty much all written by the time of Ezra and the Persian period in 450 BC. So they're pretty gosh darn old, and they must record reliable traditions about the Jews. 450 BC, the time of Ezra, the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, were supposed to have been written by pretty much every theory of 20th century scholarship, from the most critical to the most believing. They all accept. It was a done deal by 450 BC. Well, the Elephantine Papyri, they were written after 450 BC. So they provide an important test to whether that stuff written in the Bible is actually reflects the realities of that time. So that brings us to the second source of information about the Jews, and that's actual evidence, archaeological evidence, inscriptional evidence, ancient writings, and that's when we get into really scandalous territory. In the time of the Kingdom of Judah, for instance, you have inscriptions that talk about Yahweh and his wife. You have that at this outpost in the Negev desert. You have one inscription at Jerusalem that talks about, Asherah and his consort. Yahweh and the Asherah, his consort. So that's pretty scandalous. You don't have the 12 tribes of Israel anywhere in archaeology. You have the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, sure, but you have another temple of Yahweh at Mount Gerizim in Samaria, and another one in Edom, which is just south of Judah, and another temple among the Jews in Egypt at this military colony of Elephantine, which is what I'm going to talk about. So the colony of Elephantine was about, was at the second cataract or waterfall of the Nile. It was an Egyptian military colony that was supposed to defend Egypt from invasion from Ethiopia. And it was manned by Jews and Arameans, some of them probably Sumerians rather. And there were about 80 papyri that were discovered because it's an amazingly dry climate. So these old documents are preserved perfectly. And so you have these ancient writings in Aramaic, which is very closely related to Hebrew. And they come from about, the earliest is like 494 BC and down to about 404 BC. And they have all interesting documents. One of them, some people from Judea clarify when to observe the Days of Unleavened Bread. Another one, another couple sets of letters happen when this extra temple of Yahweh in Egypt was destroyed by the Egyptians who were mad at them. And so they wrote Jerusalem and Samaria and the Persian governor and asked for permission to rebuild another temple of Yahweh in Egypt in about 409 BC, I think. And they got permission. The people in Judea and Samaria, they said, sure, why not? Go for it. We're okay with it. It's cool. This is after Deuteronomy was supposed to have been written that says you can only have sacrifices in one temple. There's only one temple. That's in Jerusalem. You can't sacrifice anywhere else. It's only the place where Yahweh is going to place his name. That's the one authorized monopoly type temple. That's it. And yet, around 400 BC, you have at least 4 different temples of Yahweh. Samaria, Edom, Jerusalem, Egypt. Huge scandal. So they wrote to Jerusalem and Samaria saying, these Egyptians have destroyed our temple. Can we rebuild it? And they write to Jonathan, the high priest, and his brothers. They write to the governors of Samaria and Cowley, who wrote the first book of collection of Elephantine Papyri translated. he commented on this request like this. He said, "There's not a hint of any suspicion that the temple at Elephantine would be considered heretical. And they surely wouldn't have appealed to the high priest at Jerusalem if they had felt any doubt about it. On the contrary, they give the impression of being proud of having a temple of their own, and as pious devotees of Yah, they're really distressed at the loss of religious opportunities caused by the destruction of this temple." So it looks like you don't have this this one temple of Yahweh at the time when they're supposed to be. And there's a lot of other really scandalous things about these Jews at Elephantine. For one thing, they weren't monotheists. They worshiped the temple of the god Yahweh, and that's the main god at the temple. But there were also other gods at that temple too. There was Anath, there was Bethel, there was Ishum, and there was Herem. When they wrote a letter asking for collecting money to rebuild the temple, it was they gave a list of all the names of the people in the Jewish garrison who gave silver to Yahweh. Each one of them contributed 2 shekels of silver to rebuild the temple. And at the end it says, the silver in the hand of Jedediah ben Gemariah, 31 kars, 8 shekels, and 7 kars are for Ishum Bethel, and 12 kars are for Anath Bethel. So these are some Jews who contributed to rebuilding the temple. And they have pagan gods, Ishum, Bethel, Anath. That's part of their names. They're polytheists. There's in some other papyri at Hermopolis, there's greetings to the temple of Bethel and to the temple of the Queen of Heaven. So they're worshiping the Queen of Heaven too. They're calling Yahweh the King of Heaven. And they're worshiping a deity called the Queen of Heaven. So, what's going on? These guys are polytheists, and yet they have a temple of Yah and other gods. And they're in contact with Jerusalem, and they think that Jerusalem's going to be just fine with them rebuilding their temple. Sounds like everyone back there were polytheists. They weren't monotheists yet. I mean, they didn't just worship Yahweh. That's true of the exiles in Babylon too, because you look at their names and there's a lot of foreign gods in there. There's Nebu and this and that. They worship other gods besides just Yahweh. There's they had a 7-day week at Elephantine. So you could say that they had a Sabbath because Shabbat is the name of the 7th day of the week. But here's what's interesting. They didn't stop work on the Sabbath. They had a 7-day week, but there's no record of them, meeting in the synagogue, doing any religious observance on the 7th day. And in fact, there's one really classic ostracon, which is a letter that's written on a piece of broken pottery. Broken pottery was basically the post-it note of the ancient world. You break a pot, you write stuff on it, and then you throw it away later. Well, here's one that they threw away. And this letter is written to a woman named Isla. And the guy says, I'm sending you vegetables tomorrow. Meet the boat tomorrow on the Sabbath so that they won't get lost or spoiled. And by the life of Yahweh, if you don't, I'm going to kill you. And don't rely on Meshulameth or upon Shemaiah, because they're unreliable. So here's someone that if they don't do work for this person on the Sabbath, he's going to slay him. They're finished. It's like, it's like a mafiosa giving an order. So they had a 7-day week, but that's not really the way you're supposed to observe the seventh day. And it might just violate that other commandment, you shall not kill. That might be a little bit in the balance there too. Then there's another, I'm just talking away here. This is a fun subject, so I'm just charging ahead. There's another fun letter called the Passover letter. It really doesn't mention Passover, but it mentions the Days of Unleavened Bread. So every spring in the Bible, the Jews had the spring festival season that started with Passover on the night of the 14th. That's when they'd slay the Passover lamb. They'd have a meal. The father would recite the story of the Exodus. The family would say, and then what happened, Dad? And then Moses led the people across the water, and like that. And then for 7 days after that, they were supposed to put out all the leaven or yeast out of their homes in celebration of the Exodus, because they had to leave in such a hurry, they couldn't put in yeast and have the bread rise, So every year, that's what they did. They tossed out all the leaven to commemorate the Exodus. So in this Passover letter, the people at Elephantine, they get instructions from a guy named Hananiah, who's a big official from Judah, on how to celebrate the Days of Unleavened Bread. And reads this. It says, to my brothers Jedaniah, who's a priest at Elephantine, and his colleagues in the Jewish troop, from your brother Hananiah. In this year 5 of Darius, which is, I think, 415 BC, 419, somewhere like that. Arsames the king instructed me to tell you, this is how you observe the Days of Unleavened Bread. You count 14 days in the first month, and then you observe from day 15 until day 21. And then there's gaps in the letter, and probably they say, put out the leavened bread. And do not drink. They're probably talking about drinking beer, because beer has leaven in it. And anything with leaven, don't eat from sunset until the 21st of day of the first month at sunset. And, blah, blah, blah. Love your brother Hananiah, whatever. So there's instructions on how to observe the Days of Unleavened Bread. The word Passover is in one of those gaps in the text. And the translators, they restore a lot of it based on the biblical text, because it follows very closely to a passage in the book of Exodus on observing the 7 days of unleavened bread in the spring. And, the days are right, sunset to sunset, putting out the unleavened bread. It's all great. It's just like in the Bible, except for some missing details. There's no Moses. There's no Exodus. There's no Seder meal at Passover where, Daddy, tell me, how our ancestors came out of Egypt. None of that. It's purely an agricultural festival. Now, Julius Wellhausen, the famous biblical critic from the end of the 19th century, I read in his book, and he probably drew on earlier authors. He said Passover, Days of Unleavened Bread, they didn't start out about Moses and the Exodus. They were agricultural festivals. It was the spring harvest season. And then Pentecost was the summer harvest, and Tabernacles was the fall harvest. It was all agriculture. There wasn't any Exodus. That came later when the books of Moses were written. Well, this is before Moses became part of the story. It's before the books of Moses were written. Really, really significant and really scandalous. So in all of the Elephantine Papyri, you don't have one hint of the books of Moses. They're supposed to be done by now. You're supposed to have books of Moses written, books of Kings, a lot of the prophets. You know, most of the Bible was supposed to be all written down and authoritative. So when these guys write Jerusalem, Jerusalem doesn't answer. Well, read Exodus 20, guys. They respond with what's called oral Torah, where you ask the priest a question. He doesn't refer to anything written. He gives you an oral answer because he and his friends, they pass it down by word of mouth over the generations. There's nothing written. There's no evidence that any of the priests at Elephantine, and there were priests, none of them were descended from Aaron. There's no mention of Aaron or the Levites. Out of the 160 Jews mentioned in the Elephantine Papyri, there's not one biblical name. There's no Abraham. There's no Israel. There's none of that. There's no reference to the Exodus, any other biblical event. There's no reference to the laws of Moses, and their Sabbath breakers and this and that. It's by all accounts, all of this was supposed to be, signed, sealed, and delivered by 450 BC. They didn't have any of it. Zero, zilch. So I'm going to quote from Cowley again. He wrote a book called the Aramaic Papyri in 1923, where he first translated the Elephantine Papyri into English, popularized them, and introduced them to the world. And he was shocked. He comments on the complete lack of evidence of any knowledge of the Pentateuch at Elephantine as follows. He says, what precisely constituted a Kahan or priest at Elephantine does not appear. One of those prerogatives, one might suppose, would be to possess the law of Moses and to administer it. Yet there's no hint of its existence. We would have expected in this one Elephantine Papyri, where they request a new temple so they could offer sacrifices, that they would say, we want to offer sacrifice according to our law. And in other places, that should have made some reference to it, but there is none. So far as we learn from these texts, Moses might never have existed. There might have been no bondage in Egypt, no Exodus, no monarchy, no prophets. There's no mention of other tribes, and no claim to any heritage in the land of Judah. Among the numerous names of colonists, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Samuel, David, which is so common in later times, never appear, nor any other name derived from their past history is recorded in the Pentateuch and early literature. It is almost incredible, but it is true. So there's not the slightest hint that there were Mosaic writings. As late as 400 BC, which is almost when Alexander the Great conquered Persia and introduced, Greek culture to the east. And in fact, when he did conquer Samaria, a bunch of Sumerians fled and hid a bunch of documents, legal documents, in certain caves above the Dead Sea, which they found, and they were also preserved. And once again, in that trove of documents, not a single biblical name. And this is like 330 BC. This is right when Alexander is conquering the East. So here you're supposed to have everything done by the Persian era. And there's not a hint that a single word has been written down of the Hebrew Bible until the Greek period. And of course, as you know, I've written several books that argue that the books of Moses were written under the Greeks and drew on all sorts of Greek sources, Plato and Berosus and Manetho. And my other interviews with you have kind of covered this material. But I thought I would just scandalize the heck out of your viewers so that they would realize how utterly the utter absence of evidence there is for these books of Moses until the Greek times. And it's all written a lot later, and it draws on all sorts of literature from the Greeks that most biblical scholars didn't even imagine clear until the end of the 20th century, and a lot of them still can't today. It's a huge scandal. The Elephantine Papyri, they're actual evidence of what the Jews were actually doing in the Persian period. There's an author who wrote a recent book. His name is Gard Graneron, and he wrote a book about the Elephantine Papyri and how he calls the elephant in the room. This is the big scandal, because this is snapshots, this is video, this is it's not word of mouth, it's somebody with a video camera photographing the policeman beating somebody. It's a snapshot then and there as it's happening, and there's not a hint of any of these biblical writings. So I just thought I'd give you all this this wonderful scandal and let it sit there for you. Well, the first mention of Moses in any literature in the whole world was around 320, 315 BC by a Greek author. His name was Hecataeus of Abdera. He was writing in Egypt. And he was writing how the Egyptians claimed to have colonized the whole world. They sent colonies to Greece. They sent colonies to the Black Sea. They sent a colony to Babylon, led by the god Marduk. And they sent a colony to Judea, led by a dude named Moses. And this Moses was an Egyptian. He wasn't a Jew. He was an Egyptian of noble descent. And because Egypt was over-colonized, he led this Egyptian colonizing expedition with some of their excess population into Judea, which was uninhabited at the time, according to this story. And, he built Jerusalem. He built its temple. He established its constitution. He established its laws. He established its 12 tribes, which is the first mention of the 12 tribes of in the land of Judea. Hecataeus took that from Plato's laws, because Plato said that an ideal nation had 12 tribes, so that every month each tribe could have a rotating duties in government. And so a lot of Greek colonies had that. It's a very common feature in the Greek world, nowhere in the ancient Near East. So, and other things were also taken from Plato's laws in this fictional story by Hecataeus of Abdera in around 320 BC, which he wrote for the Ptolemies, who were the rulers of Egypt after the time of Alexander the Great. Because Ptolemy was one of his generals, and so he, they established Alexandria. They created a big empire centered in Egypt, and the Ptolemies ruled there. And they established the Great Library of Alexandria, famous, biggest library in the world, held all the books in the world. And around 270 BC, the Ptolemies had heard this rumor that the Jews had this guy named Moses, that Hecataeus wrote about. He supposedly wrote down their constitution and laws. And so Ptolemy sent a letter with gifts, and it was very official, to Jerusalem saying, hey, we've heard rumors about these laws of Moses that some guy named Moses supposedly came up with in ancient times. Could you come up with a copy for the Great Library? So the Jews, the high priest and the Senate, they said, sure, we can do that. So yeah, so they came to Alexandria according to my model of how the books of Moses were written. They came to Alexandria in response to that official request. And they wrote a version of the colony story under Moses and how, yeah, he founded 12 tribes. Yeah, he founded the Constitution and laws. They expanded on this fictional story by Hecataeus of Abdera, whose story didn't resemble the Bible at all. Judea was uninhabited. Moses didn't die in the land of Moab. He actually went and he built Jerusalem and its temple. Doesn't resemble at all. Totally independent. The Jews who wrote the story of Moses, the Exodus story, they based it on this Greek story that they read in Hecataeus. So that's kind of where it all comes from, and I've laid it out in a lot more detail in my books. But the Jews, they had access to a lot of Greek literature, including some Egyptian traditions, some true, some false, some slanderous about the Jews, and they kind of took bits and pieces of all of that and put it into their story in the books of Moses. And and that's how we get the Torah. About 270 BC, deep into the Hellenistic era, using all sorts of Greek sources, and we can finally, track down what a lot of the sources of those biblical authors were, where they were writing, what books were in their library. We've got a lot of the story now, just in the last couple of decades.
The Greeks invented monotheism. It systematically went through every ancient Near Eastern law, every biblical law, and every Greek law, compared them to see which one the biblical law came closest to. Now, Plato said, if you're going to create a nation, you want it to last forever and the citizens to be obedient. What you have to do, convince them that their laws were given by a god in ancient times and that they had never been changed from then till now, so that the whole citizenry superstitiously inclined to believe and accept them and never revolt against them. So he said you have to create that illusion any way possible, because Minos of Crete and Lycurgus of Sparta and other Greek lawgivers, with the most successful, long-lasting constitutions, they were the ones that said, our laws came from Zeus, or our laws came from the Oracle of Delphi. You have to convince them that you have this body of divinely inspired law. Ptolemy II Philadelphus contacted the authorities in Jerusalem, and they sent 72 elders a copy of the books of Moses to translate into Greek for the Great Library.
It was Berosus, who was a Babylonian priest who wrote around 278 BC. So I got a hold of his all the surviving fragments of his book in a collection found in the University of Oregon, photocopied it all, read it, and I was struck how incredibly close Berosus read like early Genesis. It had a creation, it had 10 generations before the flood, it had the flood account, so on and so forth. And I was like, how is that possible? Because Berosus was not reading the Bible. So I just filed that under interesting, because I didn't know what to do with that, because Genesis was written, centuries earlier, according to most standard theories. Then I ran across the research of Niels Peter Lemke, who was a professor at the University of Copenhagen. And he said that the Pentateuch could have been written in the Hellenistic era. That the first evidence for it really was the Septuagint translation. And we don't know how much earlier than the Septuagint translation of around 270 BC, the Pentateuch was actually written. So I thought, wow, that could explain the similarities with Berosus if Genesis was using Berosus instead of vice versa. So I did a systematic study of all the parallels between the cuneiform traditions, Genesis, Berosus, and I found that Genesis really resembles Berosus more than the earlier original cuneiform accounts that Berosus was largely reproducing. And so this led me to consider maybe the Pentateuch was written late. And then I started considering other Greek sources that resemble the Pentateuch, also in the Hellenistic era, that everyone has assumed copied from the Bible. Hecataeus of Abdera, Manetho with his stories of an exodus of the Hyksos to Jerusalem, and the later figures and I kept on. Every time I would look at these Hellenistic era sources, all the evidence showed that they really were completely unaware of the biblical account, and that there's a definite relationship between the two in many cases, but it could only be explained by the Pentateuch borrowing from these Greek sources. So that ultimately led to my book, Berosus and Genesis, which I just wrote just out of sheer curiosity. And a friend of mine who was going to the University of Copenhagen at the time, Greg Doudna, he showed that to one of his professors, the famous Thomas L. Thompson, without my knowledge or asking him to. Thompson read it. He says, we've got to publish this book. And so, boom, the book got published. And I've been really one of the foremost scholars on the subject of Greek sources in the Pentateuch and the Hebrew Bible since then. The Elephantine Papyri in particular is an extremely relevant example. They were written in the military colony of Elephantine, which is at the first cataract of the Nile. It's an island there. And there were Jewish military colonists there to protect the border of Egypt against invasion from Ethiopia. And there were, in this dry Egyptian climate, there's this treasure trove of documents that from about 450 to 400 BC that were discovered at Elephantine, written by these Jewish military colonists. And they corresponded with Jerusalem. They, there's lots of legal deeds and this and that. There's not one reference in any of the Elephantine papyri about any religious writings. No Moses, no Abraham, no David. They had their own temple at Elephantine in violation of the Deuteronomic code, and they were in communication with Jerusalem and Samaria, but evidently it was not a problem. They knew a 7-day week, but they didn't observe the Sabbath because they have business documents written on Saturdays, and they have one boat owner who threatened an employee, you have to pick up these vegetables on Saturday or else I'll have you killed. You pick those up. So, it was just business as usual on Saturdays. And there's no evidence whatsoever that any biblical writings were in existence as late as 400 BC, basically on the eve of the Hellenistic era, which is, of course, after Alexander the Great conquered the East in, the 330s, 320s BC. So that's a huge scandal that there's no support for biblical literature or many biblical customs among the Jews at Elephantine as late as around 400 BC. There were communications from Judea about religious matters that did not cite or quote the Pentateuch. There were many opportunities where they should have known about the Pentateuch if it was in existence, but there's no evidence of that. There's a book by Gardner about the Elephantine colony and all the literature, and how this polytheistic, they worshiped multiple gods, including at the temple. Polytheistic Judaism was evidently the norm at that time. The Elephantine were not some heterodox exception. This is just contemporary evidence of what the religion of Yahweh looked like at that time. One of his professors said, yeah, that's really the elephant in the room, because it flies in the face of all this long tradition of scholarship that assumes that these biblical books were written centuries earlier. And there's just no evidence, and the contemporary evidence points in exactly the opposite direction. Pentateuch's a late literature. Yeah, they wrote it in Hebrew. Clearly, the Pentateuch was written in Hebrew. It's a very wooden translation, literal, word for word, into the Greek. So they wrote it in Hebrew, translated it practically immediately into Greek. Basically 2 editions. One Hebrew edition, one Greek edition. Very similar to the Darius' law code of about a century earlier in Egypt that had all the laws of Egypt that were published, and they were published both in Demotic, which was the local Egyptian language, and at the same time Aramaic, which was the universal language of the Persian Empire at that time. So the Egyptian laws came out in two languages simultaneously, and the same model seems to be true for the Hebrew Pentateuch. What I found in Bereshit and Genesis there were all these Greek sources, running right up to like 273, 272 BC, which is virtually the same time as the Septuagint translation, which we know was from 273 to 269 BC. So I found you have these Greek sources that were found in the Great Library of Alexandria, and at virtually the same time, tradition says Jewish and Samaritan scholars were invited to Alexandria to create an edition of the Laws of Moses for the Great Library. So you have all these Jewish scholars in the Great Library of Alexandria, which was the center of learning of the whole world at that time. They had access to Berosus, Manetho, Plato, Hecataeus, Homer, Hesiod, the whole gamut of Greek literature. That's where they were working under royal patronage of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. And they were creating an edition of, the Pentateuch and the Laws of Moses for the Great Library. So the Great Library was the center of all of this. It's where the sources were. It's where I say it was written, and then it was where it was immediately translated as a prestige edition for the Great Library. So I think it all happened with these bilingual Jewish and Samaritan scholars who knew Greek and Hebrew in Alexandria around 270 BC, 272, 273. And they put them all together, all these various sources. They consolidated them, yes. I think they were all contemporary. Tradition said that it was a team of scholars at Alexandria, Jewish and Samaritan. And the tradition says it took 70 scholars to translate the books of Moses into Greek. Septuagint scholars say, no, there's maybe 2 or 3, because we can detect these different people doing the translating. So why were there so many scholars there? Well, the J Yahweh source, these were probably Jewish scholars because a lot of their stories involved Judea. And the E source were probably Samaritan scholars because a lot of those take place a little bit further north. And the Deuteronomists and the priests, those were other groups. They were all collaborating on this together. They're all intertwined. They're basically contemporary. It was a team effort. Sometimes you have J using E. Sometimes you have E using J. Sometimes J uses P. Sometimes P uses J. So they were all working together, copying each other. Sometimes some stories, like the Joseph story, appears to have been co-written by J and E, the Yahwist and the Elohist, because they can separate those two parts of the Joseph story. But when you divide the novella into 2 parts like that, neither part make any sense. But they make a beautiful story when they're together. So you had J authors and E authors together in the same room working on this as a team. Anyway, that's my model. It's like a documentary hypothesis, but it's a collaborative model. It's very similar, again, like the laws of Darius, codified in 500 and something BC, because they had priests, they had warriors, and they had scribes, three different teams that collected together those laws and put together laws of Darius in 8 volumes. There's a lot of collaborative, collective authorship going on back in that day. So I have no problems with the distinct sources, but I just view them all as contemporary, basically in the same room together. Yeah, the basic outline of the Exodus story was found in the writings of Hecataeus of Dara around 320 to 315 BC. He had a fictional foundation story, a typical Greek foundation story, in which an Egyptian named Moses set out from Egypt with a colonizing expedition to Judea, which was completely uninhabited at the time. And he established its capital, Jerusalem, built its temple, established its constitution and laws, and divided it into 12 tribes, like Plato recommended, and basically instituted all the ancient customs of the Jews. And this is one of many fictional foundation stories in Hecataeus. And obviously was not acquainted with the biblical account at all, because it contradicts it at virtually every point. But he wrote this in a book called the Egyptiaca, or the History of Egypt, that he wrote for the Ptolemies. And it was used to educate the young princes, including Ptolemy II Philadelphus. So they were all familiar with these traditions from Hecataeus, including this fictional foundation story, which was meant to aggrandize the Egyptians who colonized the world. They colonized Babylonia and Athens, and there's all sorts of fictional stories to that effect. So in the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus, they thought there was a figure named Moses, an Egyptian, who gave the Jews their ancient constitution and laws. And because the people who created the Great Library, they wanted it to have all the books in the world, and especially their legal section. They wanted all the laws in the world for reference. So they sent to the Jews and said, hey, we want a copy of those laws of Moses that we keep hearing about, that Hecataeus wrote about. And, the Jews and Samaritans said, sure, why not? We'll comply. We'll come to Alexandria, as you're inviting, and we'll put together a set of Mosaic laws. So Manetho had also he had a couple kind of scandalous foundation stories of the Jews. They said that they were wicked Asiatics who had overthrown the Egyptians, and the Egyptians had to expel them back into Judea because they were such scoundrels. And so the Pentateuch also countered some of Manetho and kind of turned that on its head and said, we didn't destroy all the gods of Egypt. The Egyptians were attacking our God, and we didn't enslave the Egyptians, they enslaved us, so on and so forth. So there's some polemics in there too, but a lot of borrowing going on. And if you look at the legal codes of Moses, a lot of that comes out of Plato, out of Plato's laws and other Greek laws. So they were drawing on various sources and reacting to them in various ways, and borrowing what they could that fit in with this Ptolemaic mandate. And they came up with the story of Moses. Much like Plato recommended, he said, if you're going to have a set of laws, the best way to guarantee that they'll stay through time is you have to persuade everybody that they were ancient and divine and had never been changed. And then people superstitiously will stay very loyal to them throughout time. And that's pretty much what was done with the Pentateuch. They created an ancient foundation story. They gave their laws a divine origin, just like Plato said. They followed his literary agenda. So you see multiple Greek sources and traditions in the Pentateuch, in my understanding of it. Yeah, the Hecataeus, he said he consulted all sorts of Egyptian priests when he was writing his book. And Manetho, of course, was an Egyptian priest. He said that this one, well, the Egyptians had native stories how Asiatics would periodically invade Egypt, commit outrages against the gods, and then they'd have to be ejected. One such group was the Hyksos, the shepherd kings. And Manetho told this story about how they were ejected out of Egypt and founded Jerusalem and its temple a long, long time ago. And then a later one was this Egyptian priest of the god of chaos, Seth Typhon. His name was Osir-Seth, and he led this band of lepers in alliance with the Hyksos. They ravaged Egypt, and they were expelled into Judea too. And Manetho adds, and some people say Osir-Seth is the same as Moses, where he's referring to Moses from Hecataeus, not Moses from the Jewish Bible, because none of his stories resemble the biblical Exodus at all. I mean, they're local, authentic Egyptian stories. But he said that some people in his day were slanderously saying that this leper priest, Osir-Seth, was the same as the guy Moses that Hecataeus was writing about. So you have, that's the second mention of Moses in ancient literature. But he didn't know anything about Jewish writings either, and his writings betray nothing from the Pentateuch. But the Pentateuch reacts against him quite energetically. So the Pentateuch has to be younger than Hecataeus. It has to be younger than Manetho and Berosus, and that gets you right close down to the time of the Septuagint translation. Well, Adam was created out of the earth, much like Prometheus created humans out of clay and water. There were several Greek myths that talked about humans in various countries being fashioned out of the earth by the gods in those different regions. So there's definitely some echoes of the Greek myths there. Prometheus too, he revealed all the arts of civilization to humanity: fire, shipbuilding, how to build houses and clothing, and because man in the Prometheus story and in most Greek myths, the original humans were naked and defenseless, and they needed technology to survive. It needed civilization right from the outset. And that sort of knowledge was only provided by the gods. They possessed that sort of knowledge. You have something similar in the Mesopotamian myths, where there were some creatures called the Akalu, who were half fish and half human. They were semi-divine creatures, and they were so wise. There were 7 of them. And they visited the earliest humans that were created by Marduk. And, and they came and they taught humans arts of civilization. So, and everyone's compared those to the Prometheus myth. It's very similar to Greek traditions and the Mesopotamians in that regard. So what you really have is a contrast between this Eden with Adam and Eve living in a paradise, not having to work for a living, just eating the fruit off of all the trees. Very similar to the first age of Kronos in Greek myth. And then after the age of Kronos, you had the age of Zeus, where in the age of Kronos, the ground just produced fruits automatically. Humans could talk to animals. They didn't need clothes. Everything was wonderful. And then in the age of Zeus, all that was taken away. They had to learn agriculture, technology. And Prometheus showed them those arts. Zeus got very mad at him for that. And in the Mesopotamian myths, Kalu showed humans the arts of civilization. So it mixes in from both worlds. The authors of early Genesis, some of them were probably Babylonian Samaritans, who had a strong background in Babylonian traditions. So that's why they drew on Berosus and the Mesopotamian flood tradition and a lot of Babylonian material in early Genesis, as well as Greek. So they had one foot in each world because they were very educated, well-read in world literature. And they also had a preference for Babylonian traditions due to their ethnic background. The Book of Kings talks about how when Samaria fell and the northern kingdom came to an end, that there was a colony of Babylonians that were brought to Samaria. And they continued down to the Hellenistic era. You can trace some of their literary and intellectual activities. And so you see a lot of Babylonian and Assyrian influences in the Jewish Bible and the Pentateuch. Everyone agrees that the main plot line of the flood in Genesis 9 through 10, whatever, 6 through 9, say, it's Mesopotamia. It comes from the Epic of Atrahasis that was found in, I think, Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So it's a Mesopotamian flood story. They had an ark. They had people getting aboard the ark with animals. They had the birds being released. All of that very clearly Mesopotamian. But the lead up to the flood, though, was very different. In Mesopotamian literature, the gods got annoyed because of all these noisy humans. The gods couldn't get to sleep, so they said, let's wipe them out. They're disturbing our rest. And that was the reason why the gods sent the flood. In the biblical account, Um, it's an ethical degeneration. Um, you have the sons of God intermarrying with beautiful humans. They create this race of Nephilim or warriors, giants, men of renown. And but then through time, they become corrupt. Everything becomes violent and wicked, and so the flood is sent as punishment on the humans. Well, that's Greek, and specifically, that's Plato's Critias, which was the story of Atlantis. In the story of Atlantis, Poseidon was the god who ruled Atlantis. He married a beautiful human girl, had 10 offspring, the kings of Atlantis. The first was Atlas, who, was a giant. And they were wonderful for a long time, but over time, they became corrupt. Every generation, these semi-divine rulers would marry human women. And so the human part got stronger and the divine part became weakened until eventually they were just like normal human kings who were violent and lawless and ambitious. And Zeus said, enough is enough. And I'm going to send earthquakes, rain, and flood and destroy this continent of Atlantis that was so wicked and lawless that they sent fleets of ships to invade the Mediterranean and take over and enslave the whole world. Plato's story of Atlantis said the Athenians fought them off heroically and, stood to the bitter end. And then this earthquake and flood wiped them out. So other than, that is the only other ancient story that has a moral cause for this world flood. The next time you see it is in Ovid Metamorphosis, which is like 1st century BC. But back in the time when Genesis was written, the 270s, Plato, he was the only other one who turned it into this ethical drama where the flood was to purge humans of wickedness and to give humanity a new fresh start. So here you have Mesopotamian elements, the flood story, with Noah and the ark. And it's combined with this whole Greek Atlantis story with gods marrying beautiful women and having gigantic offspring, and then the world degenerating, and that's why there was a flood. So there's a good example of the Greeks and the Babylonian myths being combined. I think that's one of the best ones, and I talk about this a lot in my latest book, Plato's Timaeus and the Biblical Creation Accounts. Well, it was basically the same project. The project was initiated by agents from Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who had heard about Moses and his laws in ancient times, how Moses wrote the Jewish constitution and laws, and he wanted a copy for the Great Library. So he sent the request. The Jews, in collaboration with Samaritans, who were probably a little more literate and educated, they went to Alexandria and they complied. And they left the copy in Greek for the Great Library because that's what Ptolemy wanted. They also got a copy of the Hebrew too, but the Greek was that was really meant for public distribution to the civilized world. Whereas the Hebrew edition, they brought back with them, and that became the new national laws and law code and way of life of the Jews, who basically reinvented their national way of life around 270 BC. Up to that time, they'd just been a normal government with a governor, and then over to one side you had the high priest and the temple. But starting in 270 BC, they had a theocracy, a reinvented form of government that was a new type of government that Plato advocated in Plato's laws, where the nation would be ruled with divine ancient laws and by a ruling council of high priests and theologians and experts of the law. So, so the Pentateuch was meant to be an authoritative set of new laws to govern the new reinvented Jewish nation as of about 270 BC. So there was a domestic market, and then there was an international market. It was on two tracks.